In the 9th century, deep in the mountains of China, a group of Taoist alchemists were meticulously mixing minerals. They had absolutely zero interest in warfare. They just wanted to live forever. But instead of brewing a magical elixir of immortality, their glowing little potion violently exploded, quite literally burning their beards off. Welcome to the darkest, most ironic plot twist in human history. This is the story of how a botched medical experiment meant to conquer death accidentally invented the gun, reshaping the future of human survival forever. Picture a quiet mountain sanctuary in 9th century China during the Tang dynasty. The air is thick with incense and the quiet murmurs of Taoist alchemists. These men were not weapons contractors plotting world domination. They were essentially ancient biohackers looking for the ultimate cheat code to the universe. They wanted to live forever. They followed recipes passed down through mystical traditions, obsessively combining minerals and herbs to create a magical elixir of life. After countless failed attempts, one particular batch brought together 3 very specific ingredients. They mixed potassium nitrate, which is also known as saltpeter, together with some sulfur and a bit of crushed charcoal. If you know anything about basic chemistry, you already know this is not a recipe for eternal youth. Instead of extending life, the mixture immediately demonstrated a violent talent for doing the exact opposite. It exploded. We actually have early historical records describing scorched workshops and terrified monks running around with completely singed beards. It was a monumental medical failure. Yet they did not just throw the ruined batch away. They bottled it up and called the strange new substance huoyao. That translates literally to fire medicine. Just let that irony sink in for a second. The single most destructive chemical discovery in human history, the exact material that would eventually rewrite the borders of every nation on Earth, spent its early years carrying the deeply embarrassing title of a botched pharmaceutical. For a remarkably long time, absolutely nobody in China looked at this highly combustible powder and thought about warfare. It was viewed purely as a novelty. For generations, ordinary people experienced fire medicine only as a beautiful spectacle. They stuffed it into small tubes to make loud noises at festivals. They used it to scare away evil spirits. They lit up the night sky with primitive fireworks. It was all about celebrations, religious ceremonies, and simple entertainment. Gunpowder was quite literally the life of the party, bringing joy instead of devastation. It remained a brilliant but harmless magic trick for hundreds of years, just a sparkly medical accident. But everything changed when Song dynasty generals finally got a look at this volatile powder and had a completely insane idea. So the festival days were officially over. Between the 10th and 12th centuries, Chinese military commanders looked at this sparkly powder and realized its violent potential. They created something called the fire lance. The design was almost insultingly simple. You take a hollow tube of bamboo. You strap it tightly to the end of a traditional spear. You pack the tube with gunpowder, and you light it on fire right as the enemy charges. Imagine being an attacking soldier in the year 1132 during the brutal siege of Dian. You have trained your entire life to block swords and dodge arrows. You are climbing a wooden siege ladder, fully expecting a defender to thrust a cold metal blade at your chest. Instead, a guard points a bamboo stick at your face, and it suddenly erupts into a roaring torrent of blinding fire. The psychological shock alone was absolutely devastating. You cannot parry fire with a sword. It scorched faces and terrified seasoned warriors in a way traditional weapons simply could not match. But military engineers are rarely satisfied with merely terrifying their enemies. They want to eliminate them. Eventually, somebody looked at that fire-breathing stick and had a brilliant, deeply nasty idea. What if we put garbage inside it? They started stuffing the bamboo tubes with sharp shards of broken pottery, small stones, and metal scraps right on top of the gunpowder. When that new mixture ignited, it did not just spit flames anymore. It violently blasted tiny lethal projectiles outward. This right here was a monumental conceptual leap. It shifted the weapon from a simple intimidation tactic to a device expressly designed to cause actual physical, penetrating injury from a distance. It was the terrifying birth of the shotgun principle. But there was one incredibly glaring flaw. Bamboo is just grass. It is quite literally a hollow plant. When you pack enough explosive powder into a fragile organic tube to shoot sharp rocks at high speeds, you create a tremendous amount of internal pressure. Far too often, the bamboo simply could not handle that stress. The tube would violently splinter and burst apart in the middle of combat. It would occasionally maim or kill the exact same soldier who was trying to use it. The fire lance was brilliant, but it was practically suicidal. If human beings wanted to shoot things faster and harder without blowing off their own hands, they desperately needed to upgrade from plants to something a little more durable. So how do you solve that? The obvious solution to exploding bamboo was to stop using plants and start using metal. Chinese craftsmen figured out how to cast thick bronze tubes that could safely contain the violent pressure of detonating gunpowder. This was a massive turning point. You can actually see the exact moment this happened in the archaeological record. Deep in Heilongjiang province, scientists unearthed a heavy bronze cylinder dating back to the year 1288 during the Yuan dynasty. It is the oldest surviving metal firearm on Earth. This was no longer just a stick that spit fire and rocks. It was a true hand cannon. Because the bronze barrel would not easily burst apart, engineers could pack in significantly more powder. They could force a solid metal or stone projectile out of the front at lethal velocities. The weapon transitioned completely from a tool of psychological terror into a precise instrument of kinetic devastation. It actually punched through armor. Now you might be wondering how this terrifying new invention stayed a local secret. It did not. The Mongol Empire saw to that. When the Mongols came storming into China in the 13th century, they found themselves staring down the barrels of these exact gunpowder weapons. Getting blasted by fire and shrapnel during brutal sieges probably should have been a massive deterrent. But the Mongols did not retreat. They were highly pragmatic conquerors. They looked at the fiery destruction ripping through their ranks and simply decided they wanted some of that power for themselves. Instead of destroying the technology, they absorbed it. As they established the Yuan dynasty and pushed their borders outward, the Mongol cavalry carried these crude metal hand cannons with them on their campaigns. This created one of the most wonderfully ironic technology transfers in human history. The deadliest mounted warriors of the medieval age essentially functioned as an accidental continental delivery service. Through relentless military conquest, they dragged the Chinese invention of the gun across the vast steppes of Asia and straight toward the Islamic world. They moved the technology far faster than any peaceful merchant caravan ever could. The secret was officially out. The explosive fire medicine had escaped the mountains of its birth. It was riding west on horseback at a terrifying speed, which leaves us with a truly fascinating question. What exactly is going to happen when this unstoppable new force of flying metal finally reaches the supposedly impenetrable stone castles of medieval Europe? By the time this mysterious explosive powder reached Europe in the 13th century, rolling in alongside silk and spices, on the vast trade networks it landed in a world dominated by two very specific things: heavy stone castles and heavily armored knights. For hundreds of years, the math of European warfare was incredibly simple. If you had a thick enough vertical stone wall or a thick enough steel breastplate, you were basically untouchable. Gunpowder completely ruined that math. It did not care about your noble bloodline. It did not care about your incredibly expensive custom armor. Once those primitive metal tubes evolved into massive siege artillery, the towering castle walls that had stood securely for generations suddenly became terrifying death traps. They simply shattered under the kinetic force of flying iron. The entire medieval social order, which was built entirely around the invincible aristocratic knight on horseback, began to rapidly crumble. An untrained peasant carrying a cheap metal tube filled with Chinese fire medicine could suddenly punch a hole straight through a lord who had spent a fortune and a lifetime preparing for traditional combat. But out on the open battlefield, the early individual hand cannon still had one profoundly annoying mechanical problem. It was an absolute ergonomic nightmare. If you actually wanted to shoot one of these things, you had to cradle the heavy metal barrel with one arm. Then you had to use your completely free hand to carefully touch a burning ember or a lit fuse cord to a tiny hole in the back of the gun. Just picture that chaotic moment. You are trying to aim a heavy iron pipe at a screaming, charging enemy while simultaneously looking down at a tiny fuse, trying your absolute hardest not to set your own sleeve on fire. You could not aim. You were basically just pointing the weapon in the general direction of the enemy and aggressively hoping for a miracle. It was clumsy, and it was terrifying for everyone involved. The ultimate solution arrived in the 15th century, and it was a masterpiece of elegant mechanical engineering. European gunsmiths finally invented the trigger. We call it the matchlock mechanism. They attached a curved piece of metal to the side of the weapon, which clamped onto a slow-burning piece of cord. When you pulled a mechanical lever, that glowing cord dipped automatically into a small pan of priming powder. It sounds like a remarkably minor tweak, but it changed the entire geometry of human warfare. Because the mechanism handled the fire, you no longer needed a spare hand to light the explosive. You could use both hands to firmly grip the wooden stock. You could raise the weapon directly to your eye level. You could look straight down the barrel and actually aim. For the very first time in history, a single ordinary soldier could fire an explosive kinetic projectile with genuine lethal precision. This singular invention completely rewired how humans fought each other. Armies stopped relying exclusively on massive, chaotic melee brawls. They started forming disciplined lines of matchlock musketeers pouring perfectly coordinated volleys of lead across the battlefield. Since reloading these early muskets took an eternity, the shooters still had to be protected by blocks of infantry, holding massive long spears while they scrambled to pour powder down their barrels. But the global transition was already in motion. The era of the sword was bleeding out. And right here is where history delivers its most beautifully sarcastic punchline. Think about the crazy geographical loop of this entire story. Chinese monks invented the explosive powder. Mongol conquerors dragged the early hand cannons across the Asian continent. But the matchlock mechanism, the technology that finally made firearms truly effective, was refined far away in Europe. So by the time the 16th century arrived, the Ming dynasty in China found itself facing a very familiar old problem. Mongol raiders were aggressively harassing their northern borders again. To defend themselves, the Chinese military looked at their own primitive hand cannons and realized they were completely obsolete. So the vast empire that literally birthed gunpowder into existence was forced to import advanced matchlock muskets from Portuguese merchants and Japanese gunsmiths. They had to buy back the highly upgraded version of their own botched immortality potion just to survive. When you step back and look at this entire 800-year timeline, you realize something fundamentally strange about human progress. There was no solitary genius who woke up one morning and decided to invent the firearm. History simply does not work like that. The gun was never a single brilliant invention. It was a chaotic global relay race. It was a brutal patchwork of continuous accumulation. It required an unbroken chain of tinkering spanning across entire continents. You needed Chinese monks to accidentally create the explosive powder. You needed relentless Mongol cavalry to unwittingly deliver that powder across the Eurasian steppe. You needed European mechanical engineers to figure out how to actually aim the thing without burning their own fingers off. You even needed Japanese blacksmiths to perfect the craftsmanship. Each group took the chaotic mistakes of the people who came before them and refined the violence just a little bit more. It took centuries of war and trade and stolen secrets to finally arrive at the weapon that would redraw the map of the world. The firearm dismantled the entire medieval order. It shattered towering stone castles and made heavy armored knights completely obsolete. It built vast colonial empires and then eventually tore those exact same empires apart. And yet when you trace this massive river of iron and blood all the way back to its absolute source, you do not find a general or a brilliant military tactician. You just find a quiet room in the mountains of 9th century China. You find a group of eccentric alchemists staring at a ruined batch of minerals in a burned-down workshop. They were never trying to conquer the earth or invent the ultimate machine of death. They just wanted to figure out a way to live forever.